This is Tammy Weiss from Portland Police filling in for Jen Hollingsworth-Reed.
Thank you.
And now we have Sharon, so we definitely have a quorum.
Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and call to order the meeting of the Oregon Public Records Advisory Council for December 17th, 2019. This is Deputy Secretary Rich Vial. What I'm going to do is ask, beginning with Steve on my right, for people to identify themselves by voice so that those that are on the phone may recognize the voice of those who are sitting here, after which we'll ask those who are on the phone to identify themselves.
Steve Suo from the Oregonian. I'm a member of the council.
Rich Vial.
Scott Winkles, League of Oregon Cities, member of the council.
Les Seitz, Mount Enterprise, member of the council.
Sharon Khosravi, SJU Local 503, member of the council.
Would you speak up just a little bit, Sharon? I doubt the phone's probably going to pick that up.
Sure. Sharon Khosravi, SJU Local 503, and member of the council.
Thank you.
Tasha Peterson, Human Resources Director for Secretary of State.
And we have a couple folks who are also here in the audience that may speak. We'll ask them to identify themselves should that occur. Now, if we could have those members of the council who are on the telephone identify themselves, please. And we'll start with Mark, please.
Excuse me, Mark Landauer, member of the council representing the special districts.
We'll go next to Emily. Welcome to your first meeting here as a voting member, Emily. Go ahead.
Thank you. Emily Harris. I'm on the council as a member of working journalist.
That gives us 7 members present that are voting members, which is a quorum. We'll also ask our 2 ex officio members of the Oregon legislature to identify themselves. Would you please go first, Representative Power?
Hello, everyone. Representative Karen Power on the phone.
Thank you. And Senator Thatcher?
Hi, Rich. Yeah, this is Senator Thatcher.
Thank you. Is there anyone else, any other members of the council who have not identified themselves? All right. With that, before we begin our agenda, I would invite any member of the public who is present or on the phone who wishes to address the council on a matter not on the agenda to do so. Is there anyone who wishes to do so? Hearing and seeing none, we'll go then to an approval of our agenda. We have 4 items on the agenda that is before you. I'll ask for a motion to, or well, I'll just simply ask, is there any objection to the approval of the agenda as written?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Point of order and objection.
Scott, go ahead, please.
So the item 2 is the legislative update, which I take it to be the discussion of the draft that Stephanie submitted to the rest of the room. I'm looking at House Bill 2430, the enrolled version. There's some language in there that makes that agenda item problematic. So it reads section, I apologize, the ORS is still being renumbered and I don't have, I'm not blaming anyone, but all I have is the draft bill. At any time when the office of the public records advocate is vacant, the secretary, sub C of that section 3, the council shall take up only the question of the nomination of the 3 qualified individuals for the governor to consider for appointment under section 1 of the 2017, or under ORS 192-461 as public records advocate. And I read that to be that the only business that can be before this council is filling the vacancy.
Thank you. I appreciate the point of order. The representative of the League of Oregon Cities is correct, in my opinion. However, as chair, I'm going to exercise prerogative to suggest that because the selection of 3 nominees to go to the governor is being discussed in connection with the possibility that we may have additional legislation, I'm going to rule that it is appropriate for this meeting. but thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Excuse me, it's Emily Harris on the phone. Would you mind saying that House Bill number again so I can just look it up since I'm not there?
Sure. It's House Bill 2430, and it's from the 19th session, and this was the bill that eliminated the sunset of for the office. Where I'm less clear is because I don't recall it being discussed at any point in the legislature if there's a legislative intent. So at that point, I think we go with plain language of the statute, but I raised my point. But that's the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you. Going then to the prior meeting minutes, is there any objection to adoption of the minutes as distributed? Hearing no objection, the minutes are adopted for the November 13th, 2019 meeting as distributed.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I guess on the agenda, will there be an opportunity, or may I add to the agenda for new business?
If you have a motion to add an item to the agenda, we'll certainly consider that. Do you have a motion?
I'd like to move that the council consider new business.
Okay. I would add a section.
I'm sorry. This is Mark Landauer. I assumed that was Steve. Could you repeat your motion, Steve?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the agenda an opportunity to discuss potential new business, and if you'd like, I can share what the new business is. And this may get to Scott's point, and I don't know whether this will be feasible, but I'd like to discuss other activities that the council can undertake while the advocate's position remains vacant.
Okay.
I'll second that motion.
It's been moved and seconded that we add under a new section 3 prior to setting our next meeting date and before the conclusion of this meeting, the new business to discuss what activities the council can undertake pending the appointment of a new public records advocate. Is there any objection? Mr. Winkle's prior point of order is noted, and without objection, we'll add that to the agenda. Okay, let's go then to the legislative update here. And this is where I think, Steve, I can kind of set your mind at ease. I do not believe it would be appropriate for us to discuss the details of the draft legislation. I do want to express appreciation to our legislative ex officio members for having this prepared. Hopefully it will be taken up by the legislature. I believe at that time that any member of the council has the right to advocate for or against. I'm going to reserve the question of whether or not we take a position as a council with respect to the advocacy for or against the legislation when that time comes, should it come at the legislature. But in the meantime, the fact that we have the proposed legislation, I think, bears on our discussion of how we proceed in connection with the selection of the next public records advocate. Unless there's objection, what I'd like to do is turn to item 3 on our agenda. Yes.
Chairman, I guess I'm not quite tracking your ruling from the chair that we aren't going to discuss an item on the agenda. When the council previously has discussed this matter in some way, discussed the conceptual language, expected to see a draft back, and I'm just kind of curious why we would abort the process at this point.
I'm sensitive to the fact that the plain language of House Bill 2430 really does limit us in terms of what the council can do in an interim environment where we don't have a public records advocate. I'm not sure that it's necessary for us to completely abandon the activity of talking as a council about our position with respect to the legislation, but I'm feeling like there's perhaps not a need to do so at this point, and rather to focus on selection of a public records advocate so that we can get to that.
Well, with all due respect, I guess I just still am not understanding. Is it your concern that the statutory language that my good friend Mr. Winkle's raised is a bar to any discussion, and that our previous discussions are, in essence, imperfect?
That is what Mr. Winkle is advocating for.
Okay, and I would, if I may, this is a fine legal point. I would suggest that we obtain legal counsel on this. That's a fairly important point. When this legislation affects the future of this council, the council and its members were engaged in and for us to now sort of put the cat back in the bag and look at the seems printed application of the council to the state.
Mr. Winkle, did you want to be heard on this matter?
If I may, I think that the distinction is that most of this language was discussed prior to the legislature is pretty clear that that there's a distinction between what this council can do when a PRA is there and when the position is vacant.
Well,
I don't know precisely, and because this was not a major topic of conversation when the original bill in 17 or this bill was discussed, and if it is, it's not part of my recollection. There's no legislative history, but it seems to me that the legislature was clear that they did not want the Public Records Advocate Council to do much of anything other than hire the new make the recommendations for the new positions while the position was vacant. And it's the law we have.
Would you do me the courtesy of reading that language again?
I can share it with you right here, and I'll read it out loud. So, Section 3, at any time when the office of the Public Records Advocate is vacant, I won't read A and B, so I'll skip down to C. Sub C, the council shall take up only the question of the nomination of 3 qualified individuals for the governor to consider for appointment under, they strike Section 1, under ORS 192-461 as Public Records Advocates.
Well, I guess I see some room for a varied reading of that, because that's a subset of the process to replace the Public Records Advocate. I cannot imagine that the legislature would neuter a public body in the meantime. That seems completely contrary to good public policy and common sense.
As chair, unless a motion to override my decision is passed, I'm going to, for the time being, take the position that the plain language of the statute does seem to limit us during this interim. I would agree that seems illogical, and it would not be something that I would hope would survive if there were a legislative change. But for the time being, I think we can work around it because of the fact that the language which went into the draft legislation was, for the most part at least, contemplated and discussed while we did have a public records advocate in place, and the presentation of the draft legislation does mean that members of the council will have the opportunity to weigh in at the legislature. I think we can avoid controversy on this by simply staying away from it for the time being. Now, we may change our mind, but that's my
There is no staying away from it because the legislature will convene before our timeline fills the position of public records advocate. Is that not correct?
Well, that's why I wanted to go next to that issue of timing on filling the public records advocate and process for that, so that we may come back to your point after doing so.
Well, fine, just for the record, I believe there is an alternative reading to that statute. I appreciate Scott's plain language, but I also think statutory language requires context. You cannot pull a single subset out, in my experience, and say this is what the law says. That's why they are subsections, they are linkages, and that linkage all focuses on the replacement. I cannot imagine the legislature expected this council, appointed to represent the people of the state, to sit on its hands for an indeterminate amount of time. So with that, Mr. Chairman, you can proceed. I won't put a motion on the floor because it doesn't seem effective, but I want to be really clear that I see this as an abdication of responsibility that is harmful to the purpose of this council, which is to represent the public interest.
Mr. Sheriff,
Thank you, Mr. Zeitz. Recognize.
a question for Les. So I tend to agree with you on, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I think I can't imagine what the purpose would be for the legislature to take away our ability to take anything while the seat is vacant. But as pertains to this particular bill, what is your concern about, I mean, what are you concerned that we can't do on behalf of this bill because of this interpretation?
Well, my concern is that we don't finish the process we started in reviewing the statutory command that creates the council, that we've gone right up to the point of the legislation, and now we're going to go silent on that. I think the public would expect that if we had, I mean, this is a result of the council's work. This is not some independent, anonymous resource out there. This draft is a result of the council's work, and now we're going to sort of sit back and hands off. It seems, whether it's approved by the council in this current form, I think it's important that the council does take a position on its own legislation.
My understanding was we have approved this already. I mean, not in bill form, but I mean.
Well, we've approved the concepts, and that's exactly my point, is that this draft incorporates the concepts of the language, and as Scott's making the point right here, that if you aren't careful of reviewing the language for unintended consequences, that seems like a normal part of the legislative process. So to accelerate matters here, my concern is that the council spent time developing these concepts in a frankly very charged environment. We reached a majority decision about how this legislation ought to be framed, and it just strikes me as very odd that we now go quiet and look the other way instead of finishing our jobs.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, may I ask who's speaking? Is this Emily?
It's Emily Harris. Yeah, I have a question. I mean, what in your thinking is the appropriate time to potentially return to reviewing the legislation in its bill form, which, as we all know, can be different than the concepts? What would be the appropriate time in your thinking at the moment?
Here is the problem. If Mr. Winkle is correct that the statutory prohibition is absolute, then until we have a new public records advocate appointed, we cannot talk about anything else. Now, I happen to agree with both Mr. Zeitz and Mr. Sewell that seems to be a tortured reading of the statute, but it is the plain language of the statute, and I have to concede that to Mr. Winkle. The thought I'm having now is this: rather than have this fight, potentially have work that we might do today be challenged. I'd like to pursue the timing of the selection of a new public records advocate. We have at least until the 1st of February before the issues around the proposed legislation are really going to be at a point that it's necessary that we act again. And so I would defer this conversation on the legislation until at least our January meeting, assuming that we decide at the end of this meeting to have a meeting in the 3rd week of January.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
First of all,
Mark?
this is Michael Crone. I want to first of all let you know that I'm here. I'm a little bit late. I'm apologizing for that. Very sorry. As you know, we have a lot of ballot title work happening right now, and a lot of it is coming due. But I just mainly wanted to say that your proposal makes a lot of sense to me. It seems like an issue that we can potentially avoid if we can wrap up the very pressing issue of replacing the public records advocate in time to look at this kind of information, or these kinds of issues rather, when the legislature is actually considering the bill. So I second your idea.
Thank you.
It's Emily Harris again.
And I'm sorry. This is Mark Landauer. I want to just be sure I understand one thing here. It was my understanding that we were going to resist the temptation of advertising the position, and correct me if I'm wrong, for the public records advocate until we had a sense of whether the legislation was going to pass, because that was going to be somewhat of a determinant for applicants due to the high profile nature of our recent history, that we wanted to hopefully provide any applicants some assurances through the legislation that they would be working or operating under a different set of circumstances. And I'm sort of parsing my words here, I realize.
Mark,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yes, this is Rich File. You took the words out of my mouth. That is, in fact, where I would like to go now. In response to Mr. Crone's observation, I need to say this, Michael. I don't think we have the ability, just in terms of appropriate noticing and process, to get our public records advocate chosen before the next legislative session. And frankly, my comments were more toward the hope that Mr. Winkle might find a way to withdraw his concern and objection before a January meeting, such that we could decide whether we were going to take a position as a council and what that position was going to be in connection with the short session beginning in February. So my purpose delay is just to help us have this conversation offline, one-on-one, and get to a place that works for everybody.
Well, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
One way to potentially address Mr. Winkle's concern is to seek an answer from the Department of Justice General Counsel Division about whether it would be proper or improper for us to consider these other matters. I definitely agree that we were statutorily required to have one meeting in which the only thing on our agenda was the replacement, but so it's not as clear to me that all of our business has to be suspended. But it seems like the thing that a lot of agencies do when they have questions like this is ask DOJ. I'm not sure what we have for a budget around that, but I may be able to get us a deal.
Well, that you may.
I like it.
I do want to say that while I think there is an argument that the plain language does limit us, I agree with Mr. Crone because it talks about a meeting within 30 days at which there's one item that you can discuss. And we have now had at least 2 meetings since that time and talking about yet having a third. So it's possible that an opinion from the DOJ might help us get by this. But I don't want to kind of put that in Mr. Winkle's lap as the fly in the ointment. I'd rather have the discussion and see if we can't resolve the issues so that we're all happy before we do that.
Mr. Chair, I have no objection, and I agree with Mr. Zeitz that a legal advice from our counsel would be appropriate. And I appreciate that people might view this as pedantic or nitpicky, but it's the law. It's the law we have.
Mr. Crone, are you in a position to secure for us an advisory opinion from the DOJ on this issue?
I will talk to our chief counsel, figure out who's assigned, and I mean, it's not probably going to be a long memo or lengthy advice, but I should be able to get something addressed to you, Mr. Chair. Does that seem appropriate?
That'd be great, and if we could do that in a time frame that allows it to get to us before our next meeting, that may resolve everyone's concerns.
And in the meantime, we can go back to talking about how we're going to replace our departed Ginger.
Is there any objection to asking DOJ for an advisory opinion? All right, hearing none, we'll make that a formal request of the council. Mr. Silver.
I wondered if I might ask a question of Representative Powers, since she's on the line. Karen, you, I believe, sponsored the Sunshine legislation, or at least were you involved in it? The repeal of the sunset, the bill we're talking about now.
Yes, I had signed on to introduce both of the PRAC bills last year.
Can you speak at all to the legislative intent on this issue?
Ooh, I don't think we had a lot of comments in committee on it, but I can look it up while I'm on the phone and then pop back in.
It's such a housekeeping, clerical type thing. I can't imagine anybody would have paid attention to it at the time, but I just thought I'd ask.
All right, and thank you, Mr. Sewell. Is there any objection to going then to item number 3 and asking the Secretary of State's HR Director, Tasha Peterson, to address us on this subject? Tasha, please.
All right, so I know that Stephanie provided what we discussed last time, which was examples of methods to evaluate the candidates once you receive them. The other thing that I was asked to do was to provide you some sense of a time frame or timeline of how long this would take. So it would be our recommendation that you would not open the recruitment until January 6th. So just based on where we're at with the holidays right now, it's been our experience that when we open recruitment smack dab in the middle of the holidays, we don't get much action anyways. People are generally enjoying the holidays with others. So rather than have a kind of a slow period and then ending up having to extend the recruitment later, we recommend that you would wait until January 6th to open it. If you opened it on the 6th, based on what happened last time, it was open for 2 weeks, then it was extended because there was a desire to see more candidates, more outreach. So I believe it was 3 weeks that it was open. If we followed that same model, opened it on January 6th, it would close on the 27th. My staff would be able to have those turned back around 2 days later by the 29th to this group and would be prepared for then you all to do the evaluation process. And then what we recommend is that you give at least a 1 week notice of interview dates, if possible. It would be ideal to actually advertise what the interview date is going to be in the recruitment itself so that people can plan for that ahead of time, and so that could even be shorter, but generally we like to see like a week notice seems reasonable for folks. And so if you follow those days, opening on the 6th, close on the 27th, received it on the 29th, and reviewed it kind of anytime through the end of that week, you could be holding interviews the week of February 10th. That's about the middle of.
Mr. Chair, this is Mark Lander. May I ask a question here, because perhaps my memory is more foggy than I had hoped. But my recollection was that we had pretty good discussion about the timing of the recruitment and how that would pair with the proposed legislation, making the public records advocate an independent as possible to the Oregon Constitution, if I recall what we were talking about. My further recollection was that it was the opinion of the council that before the recruitment takes place, that we should find out how the bill that we were proposing fared before the legislative assembly, because the outcome of that legislation could impact the folks who may or may not want to apply. Now, is my memory completely off kilter? Because if we are going to use the timing that I just heard beginning in January, obviously we won't have any conclusion to the legislation that is being introduced. As a matter of fact, if we were to go through the recruitment, the very dynamic of that position could change very substantially midstream through the hiring process. So I'm asking what our timing is here, because I'm unclear.
Thank you, Mark. You are correct that discussion did take place. We did not reach a conclusion, and in fact, that was part of the purpose of renewing the discussion at today's meeting. But in listening to the tape of the meeting, I will say that you're correct that that was part of the discussion. We do not have a conclusion on that yet, and I think it's certainly worthy of more discussion before we make a decision.
It's just a thought I would add here is just that, so to be clear, what I'm trying to say is that the earliest that we should look at recruiting is the 6th. That was the earliest. It would take about 6 weeks to do it from start to finish. So where we place it, that's a decision to be made. If that's helpful clarification.
That helps a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, where we start is certainly something worthy of discussion. Now, the choice really is, do we put potential folks that are looking to be appointed as the public records advocate in a position of not knowing whether the governor will choose from 3 or whether it will be the council that makes the decision? That would not necessarily completely be an impediment to folks that wanted to apply. I'm sure if they knew that there was that uncertainty, it might make a difference to some, but perhaps not all. Or do we choose to wait and take that uncertainty completely out of the process?
Sure.
Mr. Zeitz.
I recall it as Mark does, and frankly, it makes sense. We have a deputy public records advocate who is fully functioning now, so it's not like the council's day-to-day operations are in any manner impeded. And it just strikes me that it would make the hiring process more clear and more linear to wait until we know the fate of this legislation and we know who is going to be the appointing authority and what the statutory structure is. So I favor suspending the recruitment process until there's a resolution on the legislation.
I'm going to make a suggestion, and then if anyone wants to continue the discussion in an open way or wants to make a motion, I would invite someone to do so. I agree with Mr. Zeitz and Mr. Landauer on this. I feel that it would probably be better for us to have some certainty around whether or not the current statutory framework was going to be in place for a new public records advocate. If we wait and initiate our process the 1st of February, and it's about a 6-week process, we would have our applicants in, we would have the initial review done around the same time that we are looking to sine die in the legislature. And we would know before we went to the interview phase and the final decision phase what we were dealing with in terms of statutory framework. To me, that makes the most sense.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question about that time frame?
Yeah.
So really, you're proposing advertising at the opening of the legislature rather than from the closing of the legislature?
Yes, I'm saying that around the same time that the legislature gavels in, we send out the notice that this is an open position. We invite applicants. They know that the legislature is processing that, but that doesn't mean an applicant couldn't put their application in and then withdraw it at the end if they decided they wanted to. Certainly, it doesn't seem to me that it would be an impediment if I were an applicant to at least put my name in the hat and begin the process. If we're not doing the interviews until after the legislature has met and decided, we're not wasting anybody's time other than an application.
Mr. Chair, this is Mark Landauer again. I sort of tend to agree with you. However, in the solicitation document, I think it would be very important for us to have to describe the current situation, if you will, and that there is a proposal before the Assembly that would make further refinements to the position of the public records advocate in its independence and its ultimate selection. I know that may be a pain, but I also think for the purposes of transparency for all potential candidates, they need to understand that the nature of the position could very well change during the course of their application for the position. So I would be comfortable with that, provided we provide that very clear understanding to any potential applicant.
I fully agree. Anyone else have any comment or question about this concept?
Mr. Chair, I do have a question.
Mr. Winkle.
Maybe this is a question for Stephanie, but is the workload manageable in that time? Because there was a reason we hired the deputy.
For Todd?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
This is Emily Harris.
Waiting.
Ms. Harris, go ahead, please.
Thank you. This is a question also for Stephanie. Just echoing Mark Landauer's concept and concern. I wonder if you have any experience or insight based on your work as to when you're just recruiting for a position that may change, you know, very significantly with the authority, lines of authority, right? What is that? I mean, how does that fit into sort of accepted HR practices? Is that a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Is it manageable? Do you have any experience that would come to bear on that?
Emily, this is Rich Vaughn. I'm gonna punt that over to our HR director, Tasha Peterson, if you don't mind.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't aware that she was there. Thank you.
Yeah, so certainly there are times where, though unique, there are times where we do have things like this pop up where we do exactly what was described, which is clearly describe what the situation with the position is in our announcement so that candidates are as informed as possible while making decisions about whether or not they might apply. I think for some people it wouldn't deter them at all. They'll be like, okay, we'll watch it. I can do exactly what Rich described, which is withdraw if I don't like the outcome. I think there's others who don't want to invest any time if they aren't certain about what they're signing up for. So I think there's always still the possibility that it could deter folks if there's still a question. So this is the decision you have to make from the beginning of the recruitment about the timing.
Thank you.
So,
can I ask another question? Does anyone know how many applicants we got last time?
They interviewed, what, 6?
But we have several dozen applicants, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
20-something, but
Yeah.
20-something with 6 actually interviewed and 3 recommended to the governor,
yes.
from who she chose. I think that's what happened. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. I just wanted a ballpark. Thank you.
More than 6.
Mr. Chairman, Mark Landauer again. I think it sounds to me as though we're fairly close to a consensus on timing here. Unless there are further questions, I'd be prepared to make a motion.
Go ahead, Mr. Landauer.
I move that we begin the recruitment beginning in early February for the position of the public records advocate, with the understanding that all notification advertisements clearly articulate the conundrum, I guess, that we're dealing with legislatively, that the position may be appointed either by the governor or by the PRAC itself, depending on the outcome of some pending legislation before the Legislative Assembly.
It's been moved by Mr. Landauer that we delay the initiation of our process for selection until the 1st of February with a clear communication to all prospective candidates of the nature of the uncertainty about what will happen as a result of legislation. Is there a second?
I'll second that. Could I offer some additional comments?
Certainly, we'll take additional comments in a moment. It's been moved and seconded. Before we vote, is there any further discussion on this? Mr. Sewell.
Yeah, I don't know that this requires an amendment to your motion, but I think we should just make clear I would put the language of the description of the process or the uncertainties in a positive light, that it's expected that the legislature will adopt legislation that will change the manner of appointment of the records advocate, and especially important that we note the date on which that decision will be made at whatever signing day is, February 28th.
March 3rd, maybe. Anyway.
So make clear that a decision will be made within the time frame of the ultimate recruitment.
So here's my suggestion. I absolutely agree. My suggestion is that we do go ahead and have one additional meeting here in January where HR will have for us specific language that we can distribute prior to the meeting so that we have comments before the meeting. Specific language that covers the notice, covers the qualified nature of the position based on the uncertainty, that talks specifically about timing, that talks specifically about process, so that everyone will know how they're going to be scored in terms of whether or not they're going to make it to a round of interviews, whether or not the interviews will be in person or maybe conducted by phone, how many people will participate in those interviews, how we as a council will manage that in terms of who on the council will be participating in those interviews, and then what the ultimate decision will be in terms of how we decide, depending on how the legislation goes. If we give HR the next month to prepare those documents, and like I say, give them to us at least a week ahead of time, I think we can come to our next meeting and have a process, and maybe it'll take a little bit of refinement, but it'll be ready certainly by the 1st of February.
Mr. Chair, this is Mark Landauer. I would certainly consider that to be a friendly amendment, despite the amendment being far longer than the motion that was made. So I hope everybody caught that of a friendly amendment, because I do consider that to be friendly and far more helpful in helping us understand the process moving forward. I would just want to make sure that we get a head nod from our good folks at HR that they can pull off what sounded to me to be a rather long list of requests that we would like to have before us at our next meeting. And provided we can get that head nod, I consider that a completely friendly amendment.
We're really fortunate here at the Secretary of State's office to have a very, very good HR staff, and Tasha is not only nodding her head, but she's doing so with enthusiasm. So Mark, I have no doubt that we'll be ready by the next meeting.
Mr. Chair?
Terrific.
Yes, Ms. Harris.
Sorry, it's Emily Harris again. A question, if I may pose to my colleagues at the council. It seems that an option may be to wait until we're totally clear on what the position will entail. But I think the sort of, if I'm understanding correctly, that there is a interpretation of the statute that would preclude us from doing anything until that issue is resolved. But we're also going to hear what the AG has to say about that. So I'm just wondering, and forgive me for learning, during this meeting, but I'm just wondering, do we know if we waited to advertise this position until it was clear what the reporting, authority would be? If we waited until the legislature was done, basically, before we even advertised, we still don't know whether we'd not be able to do anything else in that period. Is that correct? We're going to wait on the AG's opinion on that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think we have to at least give the AG an opportunity to weigh in on that before anybody could answer it, Emily.
Okay, so then I might, if I may, amend or propose a suggestion that when we reconvene in January, that we also consider, once we know what that ruling is, we also consider that in our decision of when to advertise the position. Because I am concerned about what the HR director mentioned, that some people may be completely undeterred, and some people may say this is way too uncertain for me to put my time into an application. So I'd like to be able to revisit the timing of the recruitment once we know whether we can carry on business or not. I'd like to propose that.
Okay, I certainly don't think it's inconsistent with appropriate parliamentary procedure to have the possibility that this council could change its mind and defer yet again for another month at our meeting in January. So I think that's consistent with what your concern is, Emily. And I'm frankly hopeful that we get some help from the DOJ on this that helps Mr. Winkles feel a little better about the statutory language, because I'd like to talk about changing that statutory language in the proposed legislation as well. Right to that point.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, this is Mark Landauer. I think that Emily has raised a good point, and I think it would require me to withdraw my motion, despite it having a second, if that's possible. Because I think that Emily raises a good point that perhaps during our January meeting, we can not only have all the information that you had mentioned before us, but also the DOJ opinion, at which time we can probably move, if we are allowed to have additional discussions, we can probably still move forward with the recruitment, decide when the recruitment actually takes place at our January meeting.
I understand you to say that rather than proscribe a date certain now, that you would instead defer that date certain decision until the January meeting?
I think so, but I also want to be sensitive to your office and your HR folks. I don't like overburdening people who are already very busy, but at the same time, I do sort of tend to agree with Emily that it would be my preference that we have the greatest group of people applying as possible, because of course then we have the opportunity to have more choices, and more choices are better, obviously. But at the same time, I don't want us to unnecessarily delay the recruitment. By the time of the second week of session, which would be somewhere around, say, February 15th, we will have a fairly decent idea as to whether or not this legislation is moving forward or not. Needless to say, the first chamber deadline is going to be the Friday after the session begins. The second chamber deadline is the following week. So by the end of the second week of session, we should have a fairly good indication as to whether or not this thing's going to make it across the finish line.
Mr. Winkles.
I don't know that I agree with your timeline assessment, because I have a sneaking suspicion that this bill is probably going to end up in rules, which would be into session game time. I think getting this position, putting it out on the 6th makes sense to me. I think there's job announcements are written in paper, not stone. If we don't get a candidate pool that we like, we can send out again with a modified job description based on the end of the session. I think there are other things this position does besides work on legislation that need to be done, and having a fully staffed office is beneficial in my mind.
And thank you for your concern about the Secretary of State's staff. As Deputy Secretary of State, I can tell you that we have the best HR staff in the state government, and I have no question in my mind that they're perfectly capable of meeting these timelines, probably standing on one foot and drafting legislation themselves. So no problem at all. Thanks for asking, though.
Oh, I wasn't clear, Scott, when you said the 6th. Which 6th?
I thought the motion was to put it out to announce on the 6th.
February 1st.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You guys have to meet to decide what you want.
Oh, right. I'm sorry. I misunderstood.
Yeah, probably around the 3rd, whatever.
Okay. But I think the earlier date, see what comes back.
February, not January.
Yeah, I'm sorry, January.
Got it. Okay, Mr. Zeitz.
Just one observation, and I've lost track of the parliamentary process, and which motion is here and which one is not here. As I listen to the discussion, I'm trying to imagine why we would want to introduce complexity to the situation by having job option A and job option B. I'm ready to be persuaded that delaying the recruitment until the legislation is resolved finally is not a good idea, that there's a need to move ahead. I'm thinking about the workload we put on the applicants to have to sort of study both tracks. You know, disclosure is one thing, but these are lawyers, right? Yeah. And they're going to want to parse the operational mode for both of these. And I'm thinking, well, why do we want to impose a workload when they're not getting paid yet? And why don't we make it as simple as possible and as clean as possible, and spare HR having to write these long explanations that, you know, become a committee report. So, whatever the motion is, if it's I will vote against a motion that says that we open the recruiting before we have a decision on legislation, because I think it adds a complexity that we don't need to add.
What I've got in my notes right now is that the motion I'm going to ask consideration of is to meet in the third week of January. What would that date be, Stephanie?
January starts on a Wednesday, right, first, so you're talking about the week of the 13th through 17th, or the 20th through 24th?
So it'd be the 13th through the 17th, so it'd be the 15th, right?
Legislative days.
Oh, that's ledge days, okay.
So maybe the week of the 20th through the 24th would be better for people.
Okay, so that would be the 22nd.
Okay.
So my suggestion is that we meet again on the 22nd. We hopefully have an advisory opinion from DOJ on the issue of discussing, obviously, the legislation as a council, that we have a proposal from Secretary of State HR as to the specific timing and process for including wording around the uncertainty of the statutory framework for the position. And at that meeting, we make the decision whether to go ahead with the recruitment on the at the 1st of February or defer it after that. Do you understand my proposal? If you don't understand, please speak up. All right, is there any objection? So without objection, that's how we'll proceed. Okay? Same time.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Can I've been dying, this is dying to jump in here. This is Senator Thatcher. We had a plain reading of, the one meeting that needs to address the question of nomination of qualified individuals for the office, but right under that, it also says that the Public Records Advisory Council shall periodically perform all of the following, and that includes make recommendations on changes in law, policy, or practice that could enhance transparency in public process and government, and facilitate rapid dissemination of public records to requesters. And I don't see where it says you can only consider these things only after you've dwelled on the question of nomination of individuals for all meetings. It just says you shall take up that question on the nomination of qualified individuals, and then another section, we as a Public Records Advisory Council shall perform the following. And like I said, there it is. There's another plain reading. I'm not sure if anybody's got the ORS open there.
Yeah, I've got it in front of me. I've got the House bill in front of me, and you're absolutely right. And for that reason, I'm really hoping that Mr. Winkle's concerns can be addressed in a way by DOJ that will help us move forward. But thank you for pointing that out, Senator Thatcher.
All right.
Hi, Mr. Chair, it's Emily Harris again. I mean, with that plain reading, do we need an interpretation from the DOJ? Sorry, I'm not a lawyer.
The problem is, as with a lot of legislation, we have two competing sections. Section 3 seems to stand on its own. I don't disagree with Senator Thatcher that what ultimately became Section 8 in the statute that says the council shall meet at least once every 6 months, and then Section 9 as to what it could do. I believe those sections probably trump, but I think in this case, since we have a concern raised by a member of the council, it's not inappropriate, and we do seem to have the time to do so, that we get an advisory opinion of council.
Also, DOJ is going to get you a good rate for the council's legal services here.
That, you know what, I get really nervous, Crone, when you talk like that, but yeah, thank you. All right. If anything, we have an item of new business, but I believe we've fully discussed the item that Mr. Sewell was hoping we would. Is that correct, Mr. Sewell?
Yeah, we have a discussion, and I won't belabor it, but I did want to say, you know, there was discussion prior to the controversy that erupted last fall over the Public Records Advocate. We, as a council, were preparing to start meeting as subcommittees to try and go out to identify potential improvements in legislation as we're required to do under the statute. All of that discussion has been put on hold and remains on hold. And to Les's earlier points, I really think, you know, to be in this state of suspended animation is a real mistake. So I hope we can resolve the issue with the Attorney General. Just sketching out the time frame, you know, if we go with the February 1st opening date, we're looking at what Tasha described. So like, you know, about 6 weeks before we get the interviews, that puts us at March 15th. You know, optimistically, if we work really fast, we could select somebody by March 31st. That person, if they have to relocate physically, could be the end of April, optimistically again. And we're looking at May, and our goal previously was to prepare potential legislative concepts for the 2021 legislature. That's a pretty short time frame for subcommittees to come up with things of substance, I think. So I really hope that we are able to resolve this and also potentially at our next meeting talk about if this is resolved in favor of our ability to do other business, that we talk again about subcommittees forming and meeting and getting to work. These are all the three subcommittees we talked about all had, I thought, widespread support on the council. They're concepts that everybody agrees need to be tackled one way or another, and so I hope we can get to work.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Sewell. Anyone else have anything further?
Yeah, it's Emily again, Mr. Chair. Just to clarify that, I just wanted to make sure I understand what we're going to ask the DOJ at whatever rate it is for advisory on whether we can just discuss legislation or whether we can proceed with any business in addition to hiring the public records advocate.
Yeah, I think we're asking the DOJ to basically let us know whether we are limited only to the discussion of hiring a successor public records advocate, or whether we can proceed as provided in the balance of the statute with all necessary business of the PRAC.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it.
Are you okay with that, Michael? Crone?
Michael, your phone's on mute.
Hello. All right.
He's going and getting us a rockin' good deal over at DAOJ.
Indeed. Is there any member of the public who wishes to address the Public Records Advocacy Council on any matter that did not come before us in our regular meeting? Hearing none, is there any objection to an adjournment? Without objection, we'll be adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
This is in our favor. We can walk and chew down with this. Yeah, so, I'm going out.
Yeah, I'm out. Bob, it's fully clear.
Unfortunately,